They smelled weird, looked worse, and came from Grandma's stubborn old cookbook. We laughed until the first bite made us quiet. Why did we hate the meals that held our families together? It looked like green jelly gone wrong. Creamed Chyote Squash had a name that did not help its case, and a texture that scared off half the family before it hit the plate. But Grandma knew better. She had seen what happened when you peeled those strange pear-shaped vegetables, sliced them thin, and stewed them in milk with a touch of butter. It did not look fancy, but it did something special. It got soft, it got creamy. It turned into something that stuck to your ribs and stayed with you. Chyote was cheap and easy to grow, which made it a Depression-era favorite. Back then, nobody turned their nose up at a dish that could stretch across 3 plates and cost under a dime. But it was not just about the economy. When seasoned with a pinch of nutmeg or black pepper and spooned over toast or biscuits, it became something else entirely. Subtle, rich, comforting in a way that no picture in a cookbook could ever explain. Nothing said, "Are you serious?" like watching Grandma drop a whole beef tongue into a boiling pot. It was long, it was gray, it had taste buds. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough to say, "No thanks." But the older generation knew something younger ones forgot. There is flavor in every inch of the animal, especially the parts that look the worst. After hours of simmering with onion, bay leaves, and black peppercorns, the beef tongue came out meltingly tender. The skin peeled off like old wallpaper, revealing the soft, marbled meat inside. Sliced thin and served cold with horseradish sauce, it tasted better than any lunch meat you could buy in a store. Clean, rich, and deeply beefy, it made roast beef seem like a shortcut. This was the kind of dish you served on a Sunday platter, and no one dared question it once they tasted it. Sure, it gave kids nightmares and made picky eaters squirm, but for those who gave it a fair shot, it was unforgettable. Grandma never wasted a thing, and in her house, beef tongue was not gross. It was gold. You just had to get past what your eyes were telling you. It wobbled. It was red. It looked like a tomato had lost a bet with a JellO mold. Tomato aspic salad was one of those dishes that made kids cry and dinner guests blink twice, made with spiced tomato juice, unflavored gelatin, and often bits of celery or olives suspended inside. It was a relic of a time when savory gelatin was considered not only acceptable, but fancy. And Grandma leaned into that fancy with confidence. Out came the ring mold, the carefully chopped garnishes, and the mayonnaise topping that sealed the deal. Yes, mayonnaise. It was weird, no one is denying that. But once you got past the appearance, and maybe the smell, you realized something shocking. It was good. It had tang. It had snap. The cold gelatin made the spiced tomato juice feel bright and refreshing, especially on a hot day. Paired with a salty cracker or a scoop of tuna salad, it actually worked. Like a zesty tomato sorbet made for adults with strong opinions. In the age of microwave meals and bland pasta salads, tomato aspic feels like a dare. But to Grandma, it was elegance on a budget. Wilted lettuce salad sounded like something you forgot in the fridge. Soft greens, hot dressing, and a pile of onions. Most people would assume it was a mistake, but this was one of Grandma's greatest tricks. Take fresh leaf lettuce from the garden, slice up some green onions, and hit it all with a sizzling splash of bacon grease straight from the pan. The leaves sizzled, the onions softened. Then came a dash of vinegar and sugar, stirred in like a secret handshake. What hit the plate looked wrong, like a salad that had already given up. But what hit the mouth was magic. Smoky, tangy, sweet, and just enough bacon to make it feel indulgent. It was a warm salad that tasted like the edge of spring when the greens were still soft and the pantry was still bare. People turned their noses up at it for years, too greasy, too weird, too messy. But those who tasted it knew better. It was not trying to be modern, it was trying to be real. Pickled beet eggs were the kind of dish that made you do a double take. Bright purple, sour sweet, and pulled from a cloudy jar that sat in the fridge like a science experiment. They looked radioactive. They smelled like vinegar and roots. But crack one open, and you would find a tender, jewel-toned egg that tasted like something from another time. Grandma loved them. She would boil the eggs, let them cool, and drop them into a jar of pickled beet juice with cloves and a little sugar. Days later, they would emerge transformed, deeply colored and bursting with earthy tang. The taste was bold, but not harsh. A mix of sweet pickle and savory protein with a soft texture that made it perfect for snacking or slicing onto salads. Of course, the kids hated them. Too weird, too purple, too grandma. But those eggs were survivors. They kept well, they used up leftovers, and they delivered more flavor in one bite than most entire casseroles. There was always that moment. The crinkle of the sardine tin, the sharp brine in the air, and the immediate sound of someone gagging. Sardine and onion sandwiches were never going to win popularity contests, especially not with kids. 2 slices of soft white bread, a smear of butter or mustard, thin rings of raw onion, and a few oily sardines laid out like they had just washed ashore. It looked like punishment. It smelled like the ocean got stuck in your lunchbox. But take a bite, just one, and the story changed. The onions gave crunch, the sardines gave salt and fat. The bread held it all together in one big, bold mouthful of old-world flavor. These sandwiches came from lean times, from lunch pails and factory shifts, when canned fish was a luxury and waste was not an option. Grandma swore by them, said they put hair on your chest, said they stuck to your ribs and cleared your sinuses. And you know what? She was not wrong. It took courage to try it, but for those who did, it became a secret favorite. You did not have to grow up in New England to appreciate creamed salt cod on potatoes, but it sure helped. This was a dish soaked in history and literally soaked in water, because the cod came dried and packed in salt. Grandma would soak it for days, changing the water again and again just to tame the brine. Then she would flake it, cook it with butter, flour, and milk, and ladle it thick and hot over boiled potatoes. It looked humble. It smelled like the dock. And to the uninitiated, it seemed like a poor excuse for dinner. But to those who knew, it was rich. It was warming. It was the taste of hard work turned into something kind. The cod was tender and salty, the sauce creamy and simple, and the potatoes gave it weight and comfort. You could eat it on cold nights or Friday suppers or when you were down to pantry scraps and still feel like you had something good. Yes, it scared off anyone who judged with their nose, but that was their loss. This was one of Grandma's strongest meals, made from almost nothing, with care in every step. Prune whip. The name alone cleared the room. It sounded like a punishment, like something a doctor made you eat. Prunes? Whipped into foam? But Grandma made it with the same energy she used for birthday cakes. She would stew the prunes until they were soft and syrupy, then whip egg whites into stiff peaks, fold it all together with sugar and a little lemon, and chill it until it held its shape like a dreamy cloud. The result was light, tangy, and far more delicious than it had any right to be. You would expect something heavy, something dense, but it was the opposite. Airy, refreshing, and just sweet enough to end a meal with grace. It looked a little strange, sure, brownish, purplish, and jiggly in that way that made you suspicious. But it tasted like a memory, a dessert from before cake mixes and ready-made frosting, something made with love, with patience, and with whatever ingredients were on hand. Grandma called it elegant. Liver dumplings in broth. 3 words that made children cry. Grandma did not care. She said liver was full of iron. She said broth healed the soul. So into the grinder went the liver, usually beef or pork, followed by onion, garlic, stale bread, eggs, and herbs. It turned into a grayish mush, rolled into uneven balls, and simmered gently in beef broth until cooked through. They looked like meatballs, but softer, smelled stronger, tasted deeper. The first bite was always the hardest. Then came the surprise. They were good, earthy, rich. The broth mellowed the liver's edge, and the dumpling itself was like biting into something ancient, something built for strength. This was no fancy soup. It was not made to impress guests. It was made to warm you up and keep you going. 1 bowl was all it took. maybe 2. By the end, you were full, quiet, and wondering how something so strange had hit the spot so perfectly. Grandma never apologized for liver dumplings. She knew what they were worth. No one knew what to think when Grandma pulled out the cottage cheese loaf. It was not meat, it was not cake. It was somewhere in between, molded from cottage cheese, oats, eggs, onions, and a blend of herbs, then topped, yes, topped, with ketchup before being baked until golden and firm. It sounded like a joke, a prank, a weird dream from someone who had read too many diet cookbooks. But Grandma was serious. And once it came out of the oven, sizzling and smelling shockingly good, people leaned in. You cut it like meatloaf. You served it with mashed potatoes or greens, and you ate it. Then blinked, because it was savory, it was filling, it was, somehow, really satisfying. The oats gave it body, the eggs held it firm, and the ketchup added a tangy, sweet crust that should not have worked, but did. It was a meatless miracle, born from rationing, necessity, and decades of making do. Everyone hated the idea of it. Some refused to even try it. But the ones who did, they asked for the recipe. Corned beef and cabbage casserole was not the holiday dish you were expecting. It was not neatly sliced meat next to boiled veggies. No, this was chopped up leftovers, swimming in a creamy white sauce, layered with shredded cabbage, onions, sometimes potatoes, and baked until bubbly and brown around the edges. It looked messy, smelled strong, and to a kid, it was a hard pass. But one forkful changed that. The salt of the beef melted into the richness of the sauce. The cabbage turned soft and sweet. And every bite brought something different. Some creamy, some chewy, all comforting. It was a quilt of flavor made from scraps. Grandma made it not because it looked pretty, but because it worked. It fed everyone. It used everything, and it made people full in the best way. You could spoon it out like lasagna, slop it on a plate with a side of applesauce, and feel like you were home. It was not traditional, it was not delicate, but it was unforgettable. The kind of meal that made you close your eyes after a bite and realize, this is what comfort really tastes like, even if it came from the weirdest-looking dish on the table. Hominy and pork stew was the kind of meal that made you ask, "What is this?" before you ever tasted it. Those big, chewy corn kernels looked like something out of a science lab. The pork shoulder was tender, but the broth looked murky. It was confusing. But then the smell hit, deep, smoky, a little spicy, and full of comfort. Grandma would slow cook the pork until it practically fell apart and simmer it with hominy, onions, garlic, and sometimes a splash of chili or vinegar. The hominy soaked it all up like tiny sponges. It tasted like memory, like struggle, like warmth in a bowl. Some people could not get past the texture, too soft, too odd. But if you grew up with it, or gave it a real chance, you learned how powerful a simple dish could be. It had bones, it had soul, it filled you up in a way that cereal never could. Grandma called it her rainy day stew, and you believed her, because it tasted better when the world felt gray. This was a dish made from humble parts that turned into something whole. Rhubarb soup did not make sense. It was too sweet to be savory, too tart to be dessert. Served warm or cold, it came in a bowl that smelled like a pie and looked like fruit punch with strands of something stringy floating around. Most kids backed away. But Grandma smiled. She stirred it gently, poured it into mismatched bowls, and handed you a spoon like it was the most normal thing in the world. And then, shock. The taste was bright, almost citrusy, with just enough sugar to make your mouth water and your eyes squint. It was strange, but it was good. Rhubarb had a bite, and the soup leaned into it. Sometimes she would swirl in a spoonful of cream or serve it with a slice of buttered toast. It was cooling in the summer, warming in the spring, and confusing in the best way. A dish that made you ask questions, then made you quiet with its flavor. Brains and eggs. It was not a joke. It was not a dare. It was breakfast. And if you were lucky, it came with biscuits and hot coffee. Grandma never flinched. She cleaned the pork or calf brains herself, rinsed them in cold water, then gently scrambled them with eggs in a hot skillet with butter, salt, and maybe a bit of green onion. It looked like soft scrambled eggs, pale, creamy, and rich. But when she told you what was in it, most people backed away. Brains? Really? But the taste was mild, almost like custard, and the texture, if done right, was smooth and tender, not rubbery or chewy. It was a farm dish, a ration dish, a use-every-part dish, and in Grandma's kitchen, it was treated with respect. Sure, it made you hesitate. It made some gag just thinking about it. But others grew up with it and knew the truth, that once you got past the name, it was breakfast gold, high in protein, full of fat, and a reminder that food did not have to be pretty to be powerful. You did not eat it for the look, you ate it for the love, and maybe for Grandma. Baked stuffed grape leaves were something you either loved or feared. Rolled tight like little green cigars and baked in rows inside a deep pan, they looked foreign and smelled like herbs and lemon and home cooking from a place you could not pronounce. Grandma would mix beef, rice, onion, and mint, wrap it in grape leaves soaked in brine, and layer them until the whole dish looked like a leaf quilt. Then came the lemon juice, poured all over, baked low and slow. The leaves turned tender, the filling steamed inside, and when you cut one open, steam and scent burst out like a secret. But the look threw people off. The dark leaves, the shiny surface, the shape. It all felt strange to those raised on meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Until you tried it. Then it clicked. The lemon hit first, sharp and bright. The rice was soft. The beef had soaked up all the flavor. And suddenly, this odd little roll made perfect sense. Grandma had brought it from a different life, a different world, and put it on your plate like it belonged. And it did. Even if it took a few tries before you admitted how much you loved it. Cold chicken jelly was the dish that made dinner guests pause. There it was, shimmering, wobbly, and strangely clear, like a meat-based snow globe. Bits of shredded chicken, slivers of carrot, peas, and sometimes a hard-boiled egg slice, all trapped inside savory gelatin. It looked like science class. But Grandma called it chicken in aspic, and she made it with care. First came the broth, boiled from bones until rich with collagen. Then strained, seasoned, and poured over the cooked ingredients before setting in the fridge overnight. The result? A firm, salty, and strangely refreshing bite. Cold, but comforting. Savory, but light. It was not everyone's idea of dinner, but it had history. Back when refrigeration was new, aspics were a show of skill, of status, of making the most from every scrap. Grandma did not make it for fun. She made it because it worked. Because it preserved leftovers, because it was elegant in its own weird way. And if you were brave enough to try it, the surprise was real. Under that odd, glossy surface was the taste of deep chicken soup. A meal suspended in time, literally. And once you got past the look, you could not deny. It had something special. Cabbage and apple slaw with hot vinegar dressing did not look like much. No mayonnaise, no bright colors, no crunch. Instead, it came wilted, warm, and smelling like a salad that had been left out too long. But that was the point. Grandma would slice cabbage thin, toss in apple slivers and onion, then pour hot bacon fat mixed with vinegar and sugar over the whole thing. It sizzled, it steamed, it slumped, and it turned into something magical. The cabbage softened, the apples soaked up the flavor, and the dressing balanced sour, sweet, and smoky in a way that woke up your whole mouth. It was not picnic food. It was not meant for potlucks or paper plates. It was meant for cold nights, fried pork chops, and cast iron skillets. One bite and you were hooked. It tasted old, yes, but old like wisdom, not like age. Old like recipes that survived hard winters. The warmth of the dish made it feel more like a side stew than a salad. But it belonged. It filled the plate and the belly. Grandma said it kept you strong. And once you tried it, you believed her, even if it looked like yesterday's leftovers. dandelion greens with bacon fat were not from the store. They were from the yard. Picked by hand, rinsed of dirt and bugs, then thrown straight into a hot skillet of bacon grease. It smelled like rebellion. It looked like weeds, because it was. But Grandma knew better. She said dandelions were free food. She said they were bitter, yes, but the vinegar made them dance. She would add a splash of apple cider vinegar, a pinch of sugar, maybe some red pepper flakes, and serve it in a chipped bowl like it was treasure. The greens wilted instantly. The bacon fat clung to every leaf. The taste? Sharp, smoky, wild. You would not call it delicious, not right away. But it grew on you. Bite by bite, it made sense. This was food that came from knowing how to survive, from foraging when the fridge was bare, from a time when grocery store meant your backyard. Kids hated it. Adults hesitated. But the ones who stuck with it, they learned to crave it, not just for the taste, but for the story. It was not just something to eat, it was something to remember, and that made all the difference. Salsify with cream sauce had a name that sounded fancy and a look that scared people away. Long, brown, and hairy on the outside, it was also known as oyster plant, though it came from dirt, not the sea. Grandma would peel it with care, boil it until soft, and then drown it in a buttery cream sauce with salt, pepper, and just a hint of nutmeg. The first time you saw it on the table, you probably thought it was parsnip gone wrong. The first bite? Something else entirely. The texture was like artichoke heart. The flavor was subtle, nutty, and just barely ocean-like, hence the nickname. It was delicate, odd, and easy to love once you gave it a fair shot. But most never did. Too weird, too unfamiliar. Even back then, it was a forgotten root vegetable your neighbors had never heard of. But Grandma knew. She remembered when it grew in the side yard, when nothing else would. She remembered how to coax flavor from it, how to turn humble roots into elegance. Oxtail stew with barley was the definition of doing more with less. Bony, tough, and time-consuming, oxtail was not exactly prized meat, but Grandma treated it like gold. She would sear the pieces until brown and rich, then slow cook them in a deep pot with onions, carrots, garlic, and a handful of barley that swelled into the broth like it was meant to be there. It took hours. It made the whole house smell like something important. And when it was done, it looked humble. Just a bowl of brown stew. But the flavor was deep, unbelievably deep. The marrow from the bones gave the broth a silky texture. The barley added chew and heart. Every bite felt like a reward for waiting, for trusting the process. The meat fell off the bone, tender as anything, but you had to work for it. That was part of the charm. No shortcuts, no fancy tricks, just patience, salt, and time. Kids turned their noses up. Adults were not always convinced. But the ones who sat down, who ate slowly, who closed their eyes after a spoonful, they got it. This was more than stew. This was wealth, hidden in bone and barley. Lima bean and ham casserole was the meal that made kids groan before the lid even came off. Those big, pale beans looked chalky. The ham was diced, not sliced, and everything swam in a thick, off-white sauce. But it was not trying to win a beauty contest. It was built for warmth, built for flavor. Grandma knew that if she cooked those beans low and slow, they would turn soft and rich. The ham brought smoke. The sauce, usually just milk, flour, and a little butter, coated every bite like a blanket. The top was golden from the oven, maybe with a dusting of breadcrumbs. And underneath, pure comfort. Sure, the beans were mealy, but they were also filling, satisfying, honest. You ate it with a spoon, probably while grumbling, and halfway through the bowl you realized you were not mad anymore. That was the trick. This casserole was not flashy, but it stuck with you. The kind of food that showed up after a long day, asked nothing from you, and gave everything it had. A dish you never asked for, but finished every time. Deviled ham salad was mystery meat in a can, until Grandma got her hands on it. You would pop the lid, and out came a pink paste that smelled like something you should not trust. But she would mash it in a bowl, Add chopped pickles, onions, maybe celery, and stir in just enough mayonnaise to make it spreadable. Then came the crackers, or the soft white bread, or maybe a slice of rye if she was feeling fancy. The first bite hit hard, tangy, meaty, creamy, and oddly satisfying. You could not explain it, you just kept going. It was lunchbox food, midnight snack food, fridge surprise food, and it always worked. Sure, it was salty, sure, it came from a can, but it was full of flavor and zero pretense. It was the kind of thing Grandma made when money was tight and the pantry looked bare, and somehow it never felt like a compromise. It felt clever. It felt scrappy. It felt like home. One bite, and you remembered the chipped Formica counter, the ticking kitchen clock, and the way she always had just enough to make something delicious. Fried chicken gizzards were not a polite food. They were tough. They were chewy. They were the part of the bird that most people threw out without a second thought. But not Grandma. She knew better. She would soak them in buttermilk overnight, dredge them in seasoned flour, and fry them until they were crisp and golden. They came out sizzling, with a crunch that could rival any fried chicken wing. The inside? Still chewy, still rich, but no longer rubbery. They had flavor, deep, dark flavor, earthy, meaty, and full of soul. You had to work for it. You had to chew. But that was part of the appeal. They were not snack food. They were sit-down and focus food. And when dipped in hot sauce or nestled beside mashed potatoes, they felt like a southern secret you were lucky enough to be let in on. Most kids said no. Most adults said maybe. But the brave ones, they discovered something unforgettable. Not just taste, but texture, tradition, and toughness. Stewed tomatoes and bread cubes looked like someone dumped leftovers into a bowl. Mushy bread soaked with hot tomato juice? No thanks. But Grandma called it a casserole. And once it hit the oven, the smell told a different story. She would stew the tomatoes with sugar, butter, and sometimes a little onion or garlic. Then she would toss in chunks of stale bread, thick-cut, rough-edged, the kind that could hold its shape. It baked into something strange and wonderful. The top crisped just enough. The inside turned soft and savory sweet. It was tangy. It was buttery. It was warm in a way you did not expect. Not soup, not stuffing, somewhere in between. It did not need meat. It did not need cheese. It stood on its own, proud and simple. A Depression-era trick turned comfort classic. You learned to love it slowly, bite by bite, until suddenly you were scraping the spoon against the side of the dish and hoping for seconds. Cucumber onion vinegar salad was sharp enough to wake the dead. You would open the bowl and the vinegar would hit your nose like a slap. Raw cucumbers, raw onions, sugar, salt, white vinegar. That was it. And it looked like something from a school cafeteria. But one bite in, and you realized this was not a salad. This was a memory. The crunch of the cucumber, the sting of the onion, the sweet and sour bite that made your lips pucker, then smile. It was cold. It was crisp. It was the antidote to heavy meats and gravy-drenched suppers. Grandma served it in glass dishes with matching forks like it was fancy. And in a way, it was. It cut through heat. It refreshed your mouth. It cleaned your palate before that next forkful of pork chop or mashed potato. Kids hated it at first. Too strong, too weird. But with age came understanding. And with understanding came love. It was not a main dish, it was a secret weapon. Boiled peanuts looked like a mistake. Slimy shells, damp texture, a soggy mess where crunchy snacks were supposed to be. But in the South, Grandma knew better. She would toss raw green peanuts into a pot with water, salt, and maybe some Cajun spice if she felt daring. Then she would boil them low and slow, sometimes for hours. The result? A warm, briny legume that melted in your mouth with the earthy richness of a freshly dug root. You did not eat them quickly. You cracked them open with your fingers, slurped out the nut, and let the flavor linger. The texture was soft, almost like beans. The taste was wild, part saltwater, part farmland. Kids made faces. Outsiders asked if they had gone bad. But once you got it, You really got it. Boiled peanuts were not about crunch. They were about comfort. About passing the bowl on the porch, about road trips down back highways with a damp paper sack in your lap. Grandma did not need to explain it. She just made sure the pot was full. Turnip greens and pot liquor was one of those meals you had to grow into. The greens were dark, limp, and smelled strong, like the kitchen had been crying. But Grandma called it soul food. She would boil the greens with ham hocks, onions, maybe a little garlic, and a whole lot of thyme. What came out was not just greens, it was broth. Golden, smoky, and thick with the flavor of every leaf that gave its life to the pot. That was the pot liquor. She would ladle it into a bowl, crumble in some cornbread, and pass it across the table without a word. You did not sip it like soup. You slurped it. You soaked it. You let it steam into your bones. Kids gagged. Adults hesitated. But the old folks nodded. They remembered. They knew this was not just a dish. It was medicine. It was survival. It was what you made when there was nothing else, and you turned it into everything. Once you tasted that salty, savory, almost sacred broth, you never looked at greens the same way again. Carrot and raisin salad with pineapple sounded like a dare. Shredded carrots, soft raisins, mayonnaise, and sweet crushed pineapple, all tossed together in one cold, slippery mess. It looked confused. It looked like dessert that had lost its way. But Grandma served it with pride, chilled in a big bowl, sometimes with a sprig of mint on top, like it was royalty. The first bite was strange, sweet, creamy, a little tangy, a little chewy. Then something clicked. The carrots gave crunch, the raisins gave chew, the pineapple gave juice, and somehow the mayonnaise made it all make sense. It was not a side. It was not a dessert. It was both. It was neither. It was a memory from the church picnic, from the family reunion, from the kitchen table in the middle of summer. JellO salad with cottage cheese and pineapple looked like it belonged in a retro museum. Molded in a ring, wiggling like a lava lamp, pink or green depending on the flavor packet. And inside, chunks of crushed pineapple and scoops of lumpy cottage cheese. It was the kind of thing that made kids squint. Was it dessert? Was it dinner? Was it punishment? But Grandma served it cold, proud, and perfectly sliced. And the moment your fork broke through that glossy surface, the truth came out. It was good. Really good. Sweet but not too sweet. Creamy but not heavy. Fruity but grounded by the tang of the dairy. You did not expect to like it. That was the magic. It defied logic, it defied presentation, but it worked. It worked like a charm, and you never forgot it. Even if you never saw it again, the memory stayed. Fried salt pork with milk gravy was the poor man's bacon, but it tasted like riches. Thicker, fattier, and saltier than anything in a diner, this pork crackled and popped in the pan like it had something to prove. Grandma would fry it until it was golden and crisp, then use the drippings to make a gravy from flour and milk that looked plain but tasted heavenly. Poured over hot biscuits or ladled on mashed potatoes, it turned your plate into a southern masterpiece. You did not need a side. You did not need dessert. This was it. A meal that stuck to your ribs and made you want a nap. It was breakfast for supper. It was simple food made with skill. And even though the salt could make your lips pucker and the fat left a gloss on your fingers, you never complained. You just asked for more. Kids called it weird. Doctors called it dangerous. But everyone at the table called it good. Potted meat spread. The 1930s tin can be savior. You're absolutely right if you're imagining mystery meat mashed into a paste. However, let's face it, that little tin of potted meat was the hero of many Depression-era meals. This questionable concoction was spread on crackers or smeared between slices of stale bread and kept families fed when other protein sources were out of reach. Potted meat spread was made from finely ground scraps of pork or beef, seasoned with salt, spices, and sometimes gelatin, and had a long shelf life and a low price tag. Others got creative, adding it to onions or pickles to add some flavor. Some were not so lucky and ate it straight from the can. And let's not forget the genius marketing. Even if potted meat wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, it was often marketed as the ultimate protein-packed snack for families on the go. During a time when home-cooked meals were often replaced by anything that could be prepared quickly, it was cheap, filling, and in its own way, a miracle worker. Was it delicious? Probably not. It was practical, portable, and didn't need cooking. A major bonus when every penny counted. Potted meat spread still lives on in grocery aisles as a throwback to those hard times. You won't see it on the center of a modern charcuterie board, but it's a reminder of survival, ingenuity, and the pure will to make something edible out of almost nothing. Yet not all food from the Depression is this romantic or even something people fondly remember with nostalgia. A lot of it was stuff scraped together to make ends meet, and I'm about to show you exactly what that means. Not every neighborhood was lucky enough to get all-purpose flour. Not every house had enough money to go out and get street food and hot dogs. A lot of people had nothing to rely on, and there was no Hoover stew coming to save them. What do you think they did in times like this? I want you to share your best guesses with me because truth is a lot more gruesome than people's imaginations usually. Mock dishes, or otherwise known as mock food culture, were a massive part of what made up the daily diet of an American during the Depression. Have you ever heard of imitation cooking? You basically try to just mimic a recipe with what you have. A much more extreme version of that was mock food, and this really took the word imitation to new, undiscovered lengths in the culinary world. People were trying to mimic dishes that they were otherwise easily able to have in normal times, like casseroles and apple pies, but with ingredients that were available during the Depression. Of course, nobody had the money to make an actual apple pie, and a lot of people didn't even have the kitchen appliances to. People settled for mock dishes, which used other ingredients like molasses, crackers, and scraps to imitate the flavor and texture of classic American dishes. It was pretty much just an attempt by people to recapture some of the flavors of the times they grew up with, the happier, more stable times. Back when people had jobs and could afford to eat however nicely they wanted to. It was less about the flavor and more about the familiarity. Nobody ever thought for once that these dishes ever tasted exactly the same or even so close that you couldn't tell the difference. At all times, people realized that they were very much eating a discounted version. Still, people found a lot of solace and comfort in familiar textures and bites. Mock apple pie was made using crackers, breadcrumbs, sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice to capture the essence and taste of a typical American apple pie. Mock chicken used pork or beans that were made to resemble the texture of chicken instead of the actual poultry. Mock chicken legs were made using scraps of different kinds of ground meats that were then breaded and fried. Ground pork, especially the parts of the pig people didn't usually eat, were mixed with seasonings and baked in the form of a loaf. This was known as mock ham. A typical mock meatloaf was made using oats, mashed beans, potatoes, and breadcrumbs, whereas mock coffee was now made out of dandelion roots and roasted barley, which was otherwise just unavailable. People had mock variants of almost everything. Not all of it was even a classic mainstay dish in American culture. As you can see, some of it was just plain and daily things like a cup of coffee. Can you imagine being deprived of coffee in a time like this? It kind of makes you shudder. By the way, the recipes for a lot of these are still up. Do you think these would end up being a good test of skill? The closer you get to the intended dish, the better you must be at. Creamed brains on toast is the meal that makes squeamish eaters bolt from the table if there ever was one. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness was king, and nothing went to waste, not even a part of the animal. While many struggling families would eat brains, they were a delicacy. Don't be fooled by the word delicacy. This dish was born out of necessity, not gourmet aspirations. Making it was straightforward. Brains were boiled or sautéed with onions, milk, and a pinch of seasoning, cow or pig being the usual suspects. The mixture thickened to a creamy consistency and was ladled over toasted bread, often the stale kind, because, waste not, want not. It looked like a bizarre version of gravy toast, but it was Instagram-worthy, and it did fill bellies when there were few other options. Brains were rich and almost buttery, but convincing anyone to dig in was another matter entirely. Kids were probably bribed with the promise of dessert if they cleaned their plates even then. Creamed brains on toast is a long-gone American culinary staple today, existing only in the fringes of foodie culture or as a trivia question about survival food. This dish is the love it or leave it symbol of grit and ingenuity. In the 90s, in that overwhelming decade of innovation, a lot of new things were coming to light. Cracker crust pizza was one of them, and it kind of follows the same concept as slumgullion stew, where the idea is to really just use whatever's on hand to make do. This was something that was a frugal twist on an all-time favorite. See, households had the idea to ditch the yeast and the entire waiting process. You'd usually have to wait a fair bit to see the dough start to rise. The alternative was using transformed crackers as a DIY makeshift pizza base. A box of crackers was something that literally did run you only 50 cents, and a can of tomato sauce and the most affordable cheese in the mart were also inflicting any serious damage on your budget. The dish was something that helped deal with the effects of inflation, which was honestly the biggest reason why families had to resort to meals like this. Minimal ingredients and almost no preparation time meant that cracker crust pizzas became an accessible way to get your pizza cravings fixed. They were able to mimic the taste of it well enough at a quarter of the cost. I don't know about you, but personally, that alone would make it start tasting better for me. This was something that really popped off in dorms with college students, though. They'd get up to cheap pizza nights on a first-year student's budget that way. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, Kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. Despite this, the Depression wasn't all just horrible stories of people doing their best to survive. It was in times like these where even the simplest joy or sweet treat made a world of difference in people's moods and happiness for the day, and that's what we're going to explore next. What people ate to keep them happy. The Depression was one of the most brutal times in all of American history, which is why it's so important to remember the ways people resisted and kept their composure. These sweet treats might seem small in hindsight, but back then, they were the difference between you having the last straw and you managing to keep going on until tomorrow. Honey and molasses were arguably more valuable than diamonds themselves during the Depression. They were the perfect sweeteners and became extremely affordable and accessible. They were at least significantly easier to get than refined sugar was. This made them go-tos for so many households during the Depression. It was the fact that they were naturally a sweetener that made them so multi-purpose. People really wanted to hoard ingredients like that, the ones they could use in several different ways, not just stuff that was good for one recipe only. Honey was pretty much locally produced, and lots of families kept populations of bees specifically for this reason. Molasses, on the other hand, was something that came as a side effect of making sugar. They were available everywhere, in large quantities. And to be honest, even the government would make an effort to spread these out as much as they could. That was simply how much use people were getting out of molasses, and they were invaluable, even more than sugar was. You could incorporate them into pretty much anything, even savory dishes and beverages. The next thing we're going to go over is beverages anyway, and I'll show you the different ways in which people used molasses. Getting back to our main topic though, molasses also had a lot of nutritional value, and honey did as well. This was a time when you really needed to stockpile anything that was good for nutrition. Molasses was used in brown bread, rye bread, and even for biscuits, doughs, cakes, and different kinds of cookies. Gingerbread used molasses, and pie fillings were also using them. A lot of these would also involve honey to make them sweeter and add a bit of a natural element to them. Plus, it felt good to at least have one familiar thing. People were using discounted versions of so much of what they were used to. For example, using brown sugar instead of white sugar and scraps of meat instead of good, lean cuts. It felt good that honey, at least, was left as people would remember it. Molasses was particularly a thing in the South, and that was also thanks to the region's extensive experience with sugarcane production. But they also had recipes that made really good use of molasses. Stuff like molasses pecan pie and sorghum syrup cakes, for example, were the trendiest recipes during the Depression. In other rural areas throughout the country, it was a lot more common for places to have beehives, and as a result, honey was very widely available. Another cornerstone of Tex-Mex cuisine and a fun twist on a cheap budget was the wonderful invention of fried bologna tacos. This was considered a byproduct in lower-income communities, one made entirely out of circumstances and the needs that would take over your usual priorities as far as meals were considered. Out with the casseroles and lasagnas and in with the tacos, you know? Bologna, unlike Fritos, wasn't something that really shined through in the 90s. It had been playing the long game all the way back since the Depression, and it was really good at doing that. Bologna had been a shoulder to cry on for the American people since way back then, and the Hispanic community didn't miss that at all. Fried bologna tacos are pretty basic. They've done a lot more with bologna too. Still, basic isn't bad, because essentially, this was one of the cheapest things you could eat. That's what I meant by it being a byproduct. People didn't really sit together and think, oh, you know what would bang on a taco? Bologna like a Scooby-Dooby-Doo gag? They instead just kept looking for ways to cut down on costs and make the cheapest meal possible. And, well, one thing led to another. And eventually, one of the top survival foods of the 90s was born. It was the street food in places like El Paso and San Antonio, and it's an example of how Tex-Mex traditions have helped structure our everyday meals. Hardtac, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtac was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtac was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtac is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. Though honestly, some people decided to save things up and go home instead. For a week or two, just to relax, you know? Anyway, at home, people's diets were changing in yet another way once again. Top round roasts were a really good example of this. They were something you would get from the round, primal cut of beef, and they were a really common voice for most families that wanted to eat on a reasonable budget. Hey, if you try to weasel your way out of buying good meat, you often end up with bad and tough cuts that are almost like rubber to chew, and no one wants that. Top round roasts were so nice and popular exactly because they were an affordable lean cut, a previously never-before-seen phenomena in the lands of the United States. This lean cut was something that was really adaptable too. You can make it in all kinds of cooking methods. You could roast it, slow cook it, grill it, or even make a patty out of it. Plus, for $1.50 per pound, who was really competing with stuff like this? I mean, sure, It was no ribeye, but at least you had a roast to come back to. That's why people would save up and go home, because at some point, the ramen noodles start to get really old. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Suet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Suet was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Suet was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months, when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in large clothing. And if things like ramen aren't really to your liking, which I personally don't get at all, but you do you, there was always a lot of healthy canned food like beans and rice. Canned beans have always been a pretty integral part of cost-effective American eating ever since the days of the Wild West and the American frontier. But while people were eating beans by a campfire in those times, in the 80s, it was more like your average New Yorker opening up a can and some rice as they'd watch High School Musical for the third time. Honestly, this was so cheap that you could easily just get it for around, 30 cents? Plus, it was a nice little way to get protein. Living on a budget is one thing, but eating on a budget makes getting your gains and just keeping your health in check a pretty hard ordeal. Things like this help a lot, and hey, you get your choice of beans. The peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich was definitely a bit out there. It was pretty unconventional. I mean, really, peanut butter and mayonnaise together isn't something anyone would really picture. It was something people made for how affordable and simple it was. It was really tough to get the right amount of calories during the Depression. That pretty much meant that most people were starving and low on energy. So meals like these, which took care of that by being calorically dense, were a godsend, more or less. Especially in a time when it was already so hard to keep food on the table. It helped that mayonnaise and peanut butter were such inexpensive ingredients to begin with, and both of those became something that families would hunt after in marts and stores so that they could stock up on it. Bread was also pretty easy to come by still, thankfully. As a result, most people simply chose to have this easy and convenient breakfast rather than anything too over the top. It was also the school lunch of the decade, arguably. I can't tell you how many families chose to have peanut butter and mayo sandwiches for their child's school lunch. In any other era, this would be the kind of food experiment you'd cook up with your friends when you were all bored or drunk at 3 a.m., but during the Depression, it was yet another sign of how creative people were. It became a sign of the times, and people who lived through the Depression often fondly looked back on the sandwich. I guess you could say that's an acquired taste. Did you know that even having this toasted was a sign that a household was doing better than others? Really. Toasting your bread meant that you had a functioning toaster and could spare the electricity. That's the kind of climate people were living in their daily life. Pickled vegetables, the crunchy, tangy, fizzy wonders that kept people from starving when fresh food wasn't an option. Cabbage, cucumbers, carrots, basically anything that could fit in a jar and swim in vinegar. Pickling is one of humanity's oldest methods of food preservation, dating back over 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia. People knew a simple truth: when life hands you cucumbers, make pickles. The magic of pickling lies in the preservation process. By immersing veggies in brine or vinegar, you create an acidic environment that prevents spoilage. This means you can have fresh, nutrient-rich food in the dead of winter when fresh produce is nowhere to be found. Cabbage, for example, transforms into sauerkraut, a fermented powerhouse full of vitamin C and probiotics. exactly what you need to survive a long winter and fight off scurvy. Pickled cucumbers were a favorite of ancient Egyptians and even made their way into the diet of Julius Caesar's army, who believed they boosted their strength. If pickles are good enough for Roman soldiers, they're definitely good enough for your sandwich. It also added flavor, a burst of acidity and crunch to otherwise bland meals. They kept things fresh, fought off food waste, and gave humans something to bite into when the pantry was bare. Ritz Cracker meat pies were basically just your average meat pie affair, but with Ritz Crackers thrown on top. Not really too inspiring, I know, but hey, it worked. Why do you think people resorted to something this simple? A lot of the time, it was less about the flavor, the texture, and what it was adding to the dish, and it was more about the fact that something new was being thrown in at all. The thing about sticking to a budget is that you really can't step out of it. You can't get a sweet little treat for yourself. You can't spend extra on white sugar instead of brown sugar. You can't afford that extra bit of flour, or that fancy cheese, or the wine. Never the wine. Regardless, sticking to a budget means suppressing your heart every day, because at the end of each and every 24 hours, you just need the money more. You might be happy in the moment when you cave into the impulse and get the thing you have your eyes set on, but when you're in bed worrying about your finances, you'll regret it. Ritz Crackers, on the other hand, were literally just for a few cents. What harm could that cause? What could it do? Not only did it work as a breakfast option with toast or tea, but it also worked amazingly as a substitute for breadcrumbs. On meat pies, it was something that helped give them a crispier crust and edge, which honestly made a world of difference to people who were deeply bored of meat pies by the 90s. But honestly, beans don't really do much for me. If you're like that, maybe you'd be more interested in a real meal like grilled cheese sandwiches. Okay, I'm just kidding. Mostly. For real though, grilled cheese sandwiches are arguably the most iconic, quintessential American comfort food we will ever come across. Many Americans tried to get by on affordable and simple staple options, grilled cheese sandwiches being one of the easiest ones. All you had to do was take some good old American cheese and get your stove started. This was for the longest time the lunch for many people working their day away in offices or college students just trying to get by in their dorms. If you didn't have a lot of money, then Wendy's and KFC for dinner were out of the options. Meals like this still managed to offer some kind of solace to people, and to be honest, a grilled cheese sandwich could cheer up most people's day, wouldn't you agree? In the 1970s, almost every kind of home, especially the ones that didn't have a lot of income to work with, whether they were situated in urban centers or rural outskirts, relied on basically just winging it. Recipes had to be flexible and adaptable, and the ingredients in them had to have easy and cheap substitutes. A pound of pasta may have just been a few dollars, but it was something that would last you for so many meals. Beans, on the other hand, were as cheap as they could get. For around 50 cents or $1, you could have an entire can. Mayonnaise wasn't ever something you would associate with pasta or beans, but that's exactly where we're going. The funny thing about being broke is it can make you part with tradition real fast. Even Italian traditionalists that would, in any other circumstance, be pretty opinionated about the use of mayonnaise in pasta would have it that way with beans. You could have a creamy dressing that turned pasta into something more, and it was also something that let families experiment and see what works best for them. You could find it all over the South and North. Instead of one specific city, this dish simply just endured throughout the country. Prune pudding is evidence that even in hard times, people still wanted a sweet ending to their meal. Fresh fruit was rare during the Great Depression, and prunes, with their long shelf life and natural sweetness, were the unsung heroes of dessert. They weren't glamorous, but they did the job. This was a humble pudding, stewed down to a thick, syrupy base. Prunes were often sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg to improve the flavor. A few cooks even added milk, breadcrumbs, or a touch of lemon juice to brighten the dish. But if you were lucky, it might be topped with a dollop of whipped cream. But that was a luxury. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Prune pudding was surprisingly nutritionally rich for its simplicity. It wasn't just a treat, it was practical sustenance packed with fiber and vitamins. But its reputation as a digestive aid made it a divisive dessert. It wasn't everyone's idea of a sweet indulgence, to put it mildly. Prune pudding has faded into the background today, often overshadowed by more flashy desserts. In a world fixated on superfoods and functional eating, maybe it's time for this Depression-era favorite to come back. But don't expect it to replace chocolate cake anytime soon. If Grandma ever made you try something weird that you ended up loving, drop it in the comments, hit like so she knows you listened, and subscribe for more forgotten flavors.